The stuff that I put in like question form
Uh-huh.
was it because I'm not, I haven't gotten my hands dirty in terms of exactly how they did things there. I'm making certain assumptions about how I know data sometimes is presented. So I know that in certain types of reports, they don't include provisional ballots or they don't include something, which will lead to people thinking there's a discrepancy in the numbers when there really isn't.
Okay. And you're appointed rather than elected. And what difference does that make as far as your authority?
It doesn't make difference in my authority other than the primary difference is that I have no authority to make policy for the county.
Okay.
I'm an administrator, I'm a staff member. So the way I look at my role is to comply with state and federal law and how we conduct elections and maintain our voter registration records. And that I don't set policy for the state or for the county regarding how elections are conducted.
Regarding the allegation that observers were not provided sufficiently close access,
Right.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the regulation, the state statutes and the regulations talk about making sure that the public has reasonable access to observe the work we're doing. Everything we do is to be transparent. But as an administrator of an elections, to make sure that elections are run efficiently and accurately, it's my responsibility to kind of manage how that happens. So every county may have different amount of space available to do their work. They may have different resources in terms of how they can provide that reasonable access. I'm fortunate in Orange County in that we've been able to make investment in equipment that allows every workstation where somebody is doing signature verification, their workstation screen is mirrored onto a widescreen TV that sits about 5 feet behind them so that observers can, without actually breathing down my staff's neck, they can actually watch what they're doing step by step. I don't know, I haven't been to Shasta's office to know what they're able to accomplish in terms of observation. But bottom line is there was recent litigation that made it up to the Court of Appeal in which regarding Ventura County and how they operated their observation program. And initially that decision that favored the county's approach was not published, but then the Court of Appeal decided, no, they were going to reissue their opinion and publish it to specifically make the comment that while observers must be sufficiently close to election workers to observe what they're doing, the court does not believe that sufficiently close means breathing down the neck of the election workers. So we have a responsibility to make sure we're running efficiently. I have a responsibility to make sure my staff are safe. And so we structure our observation program in a way that we believe gives the public sufficient access and closeness to what we're doing. But it doesn't mean that they stand over them directly. And the other thing that's key about observation is observers have no right to challenge a determination made by the elections official. What they have a right to challenge is whether or not the election staff is properly following the law and policy and procedure for the office. But like an individual decision on whether a voter's signature compares on the envelope to the signature we have on file, that is not challengeable. That's something that our office, we make that decision. The observers can only say, well, we think this person who's doing signature verification is not complying with state regulations regarding how signatures are to be compared.
But they're not making the call as far as, no, that doesn't match,
Correct. Yeah, observers don't have that right.
Yeah, okay. Um, the allegation that the Hart voting system had an error rate of 46%. We remember the overspray issue.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, so on that, when I read that, and this is something I've heard before, maybe not specific to the same situation, but when the EAC's voluntary voting system guidelines are established and says that a voting system cannot have an error rate over a certain, percent of a percent, that is not referring to whether the system can scan a ballot because of a printing error. That is regarding whether if the ballot was scanned, are the votes accurately being tabulated? That's what that error rate talks about. So attributing an error rate to the voting system because it rejected ballots because of a printing issue is not an error rate of the voting system. Granted, I'm not saying the voting system has no stake in that situation. That is something that Hart currently is looking at, whether they can make improvements to their software to reduce the number of ballot rejections. We experienced ballot rejections in the primary in 2024 in Orange County, and reported that to the Secretary of State. But we print our own ballots in Orange County and mail them ourselves. We're the only county that follows a ballot all the way from design, printing, and mailing. We do all that in-house. And so we worked with our vendor that supports the printing equipment that we have to figure out a way to make sure that during the general election that didn't happen again, that overspray issue that you mentioned. And so we worked with them to make sure that we didn't have that printing issue in the general election, and we had a much lower ballot rejection rate in scanning. But ultimately, the voting system, if it rejects a ballot when you're scanning it, there is that ballot duplication process that then you, as an election official, want to still make sure that that voter's intent is properly recorded and their votes are counted. And so even if the voting system's rejecting a ballot, you then send that ballot to the duplication team to copy over the votes that the voter made, and then audit to make sure that those were copied correctly, and then scan the copied ballot.
But bottom line, overspray is not an error in and of
Yeah.
itself.
Well, it's not an error of the voting system. Obviously, it's a printing issue. I think the voting system probably has some role in it in terms of how their print files are created that may cause that. I don't know all the technical stuff, and I don't know that they've actually gotten to the bottom of why it happened in terms of the printing error, because there was one printer that printed ballots for San Joaquin in 2022 that had the issue. We had the issue, and we printed in-house using the same kind of web press printer. And in the primary in 24, and then Shasta and Nevada County had the issue using an outside ballot printer for the election in the general. So I think that's a situation that the Secretary of State's working with the vendors to try to address. And Hart is looking at their software to see if there's improvements they can make to the voting system software ahead of the elections in 26 to minimize that issue.
The allegation that 100 ballots were not included in the cast vote records.
Yeah, so again, this is a situation where, based on my experience, I can tell you why, when I provide cast vote records in Orange County to the member of the public through a Public Records Act request, and why it doesn't exactly match the number of ballots included in the voting system count, is that for any precinct that has less than 10 ballots cast in that precinct, because under the California Constitution, all voting is secret and voters have a right to cast a secret ballot, there is a provision in the elections code that if you have a precinct with less than 10 ballots cast, you do not publish the votes in that precinct as its own thing, because it could be potentially too easy to figure out how the voters in that precinct voted. An example I'll give you is, like, there's that community in New Hampshire that always votes right after midnight, so they can be the first one to post their results. In the last presidential election, when they posted their results, every person in that community voted for the same candidate for president. So you knew how everybody voted. That's not secret ballot. So California provides that when you've got a smaller precinct, to protect the voter's secrecy, you do not publish that. So what we do in Orange County is that when we publish our statement of votes, which is by precinct, shows how the voters in that precinct voted for each candidate, we combine all those small precincts into a new precinct we created, so that you don't know which precinct those votes comes from. And then when somebody asks for the cast vote records, we do not provide cast vote records for ballots from those small precincts. So they're not included in what we provide, because we believe those cast vote records are confidential to protect the secrecy of the vote of those voters.
Got it. The allegation more ballots were counted than the number of voters casting a ballot.
Yeah, so the key thing about that is that state law requires that the voting system, the system that you create, you design, create, scan, and tabulate votes in, cannot be in any way connected directly in any way to your election management system, which is where your voter registration rolls are and where you record whether somebody voted in the election. And so when you request a report from the voter registration system about how many voters participated in the election, it's not going to ever be an exact match to the number of ballots that your voting system said it counted. One reason is that they're not connected and that the voter rolls are being updated every day. In Orange County, we've got 1.9 million voters. We are in 2024, we made an average of 80,000 updates to our voter records every month. So every day, voter records are being updated. And so there's a chance that somebody who voted in, who's in my registration roll today may not have been in my county in November to vote, but it'll show that they voted in the election in another county. It just won't, when you run that report though, it doesn't say this voter voted in another county, it just says this voter voted in that election. The reverse is if I had somebody in my county in November who cast a ballot and now has moved to another county or out of state, if I run that report today, they're going to be missing from that report. Because when you run reports from your voter registration system, it gives you what exists today. So they don't ever quite match up. The other reason is that when you run reports in the voter registration system and the election management system, those reports do not include provisional ballots. So my expectation is that the difference between the number of voters who are on that voter file as listed as having participated in the election, that that list is probably lower closely to the number of provisional ballots that were included in the count.
The last one you have here, the petitioner cites elections code 1514004D3. It claims it requires ballots to be matched to the verified voters, but if you read the statute, it does not say what the petitioner claims.
Yeah, so let me pull that. Hold on.
Okay, 15104D3.
Yeah, D3. So 15104 talks about processing vote by mail ballots during the canvass, and it talks about making sure that the public is open when you're processing ballots, that they're open to the public, and identify certain groups that are allowed to observe. D3 says that when you are processing those ballots, that you have to make sure that the vote by mail ballots are secured before they are counted on election day. So, it's not, that doesn't specifically talk about chain of custody or those things. Really, the key thing about the canvass period is you have to reconcile the number of ballots that were in the results and the voter participation. And so you're looking at every precinct to see whether there's any discrepancies, and if those discrepancies are big, that might be an issue you need to look into. And so I would say for Orange County, when we did that reconciliation, we had one vote center, we were concerned that they weren't properly checking people in. But when we did the reconciliation and reviewed the equipment that they used, we realized that the electronic voter rosters they were using weren't transmitting information didn't transmit information on a certain day. And so once we made sure that that was uploaded, everything aligned, and the number of voters checking in and the number of ballots cast then reconciled. So you're reconciling, but you're not looking for an exact match. The other thing is that while the ballots as long as the vote by mail ballot's in the envelope, the voter who cast it. But there's nothing on the ballot itself that identifies the voter, and there can be nothing on the ballot itself under state law that identifies the voter. So once you accept that ballot for counting and you remove it from the envelope, you have no way of going back. And if a voter asks me, I want to see that the voting system counted the votes on my ballot exactly how I marked it, I can't do that because there's no way for me to go and say, this is the ballot you cast, because there's nothing on it that identifies the voter. So it's just one, as I mentioned, the non-connection between voter participation in the registration system and the voting system that counts ballots. They're not connected. The voting system, when counting if a ballot was cast, is if you've got a 2-card ballot, it's only counting the first card as a ballot. So if a voter casts only the second card, the B card, it's not going to show then that a ballot was cast. You'll obviously be counting votes, so they end up in the results. But in terms of that statistic, in terms of number of ballots that are in the results, if somebody only cast a B card and not the A card, it will not be counted as a ballot.
Got it.
So there's a number of things that there's no way, unless you have a 1-card ballot and certain things, other things that are in play, it's pretty much impossible to have an exact match.
Your interest in Shasta County, why did you send us this information just out of Orange County?
Well, we, county elections officials, we are a pretty close-knit group in terms of we meet regularly to talk about election administration. There are there is a news clipping service specifically to election service stories. And so I will look at that every day. And given what was going on with some of the allegations in Shasta County and the effort to try to move to hand counting, I was obviously paying attention to that because as I said, there are certain voters in Orange County who have the same beliefs and go to my board of supervisors and make the same arguments. So I just kind of believe as someone who works for a large county that is a leader in our statewide association, that I feel a responsibility to kind of, if I can, to help people understand the law, especially in situations where I know that the elections official in that county can't necessarily speak. So like in this situation where there's litigation, I know that Tom and Joanna can't talk. So it was my attempt to try to at least provide you with some background, because I think I saw in one of the stories that you did that, you had a former supervisor who made very direct statement about legality of how the election was conducted. So I wanted to at least give you some background in terms of some of the things to look for in terms of what they're alleging in the lawsuit. And we have somewhat of a connection with Shasta County because when the board made the move towards hand counting and canceled its contract with Dominion, and when they then took on the Hart intercivic voting system, that's a system that we run here. So, when Joanna and Kathy were trying to get up to speed on how to operate Hart, I was having my team provide whatever kind of support we could about how that system worked and things to look for. So, we're the second largest county or voting jurisdiction in the country that uses the Hart intercivic system. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, we kind of feel an obligation to share what we learn in operating the system and an obligation to share how, what we know about how elections are conducted to educate people. It's important for me that the media understands. I mean, this is, as I said, elections are complicated. They're not necessarily, unless you've been covering them for a long time, which you may have, but they're not easy to figure out. Bottom line, what I would say is that we're still recording, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So bottom line, what I would want to let people know is that elections officials are committed to ensuring that elections are conducted accurately and fairly and transparently. There unfortunately will be some disagreement between us as administrators and members of the public in terms of what that means, but we have to do our best as elections officials to meet that moment and to serve the voters in the best possible way we can. That doesn't mean we're never going to make mistakes, but we're doing the best we can. This issue potentially is going to be litigated in court, and a judge will decide whether Shasta County did things appropriately or not. But bottom line, I know that the heart is there in Shasta County with that team to want to do the best job possible.
Yeah, and if you're kind of following along, I guess you saw that Tom Toller is resigning.
I did.
Yeah, kind of. He's a friend, and I'm sorry to say that. That he's gonna have to.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Obviously, he went into that with open eyes and wanting to understand how elections worked, and from what I've seen from a distance and reading about how he conducted himself, it looks like he stepped up to the moment and supported his staff and saw what was happening and how elections worked and understood that they were doing a good job. So it is unfortunate because he was somebody, even though he was appointed, he still went in. There may have been questions about what his approach was going to be, but ultimately it to me looked like he did the right things.